They deceived her using education. Where are you watching from today, family? Tell us your city and country in the comments below. And before we begin, please subscribe, like, and share this video so we can get this story across to a wider audience and together rewrite the false history we were told. The village of Asokore slept beneath the golden light of the setting sun, hidden deep within the thick forests where ancient trees stretched so high they seemed to touch the heavens, and where the elders said spirits whispered through the leaves when the wind blew at night. In this peaceful land lived a young girl named Adwoa, the only daughter of Kwaku and Efia, farmers known throughout the region for their kindness and wisdom. Adwoa was unlike the other girls in the village. While they loved singing, dancing, and learning the ways of the market, Adwoa loved questions. She asked why the stars moved. She asked why rain came from clouds. She asked why the moon changed shape. Her father often laughed and said the girl had more questions than the village priest had answers. Everyone believed Adwoa was born for greatness, though none knew what form that greatness would take. Then one dry season, when the dust from the roads rose like smoke and covered the leaves, strangers came to Asokore. They wore polished shoes, bright clothing, and carried books under their arms. They introduced themselves as teachers from the city. They said they had built a grand school beyond the hills, a school where children could learn the wisdom of the modern world, read books from foreign lands, and one day become leaders, doctors, and rulers of nations. The villagers gathered beneath the sacred tree and listened with wide eyes as the strangers spoke of a future brighter than anything they had ever imagined. They promised the children who attended would return rich, powerful, and respected by kings. Some elders were suspicious, but many parents were excited. And none were Adwoa's father, who believed his clever daughter deserved every chance to shine. He sold 2 goats to pay for her enrollment, and told her with tears in his eyes that she must learn everything and come back to change their lives forever. Adwoa promised she would. On the day she left, the whole village sang farewell songs. Her mother tied a blessed cloth around her waist and whispered never to forget who she was. The school stood far from the village on land so wide Adwoa could barely see its edges. Tall white walls surrounded the compound. Guards stood at the gate. Strange bells rang through the air. At first, Adwoa was amazed. The classrooms were bigger than any hut she had ever seen. Shelves held more books than she knew existed. The teachers spoke with confidence and power. But from the first night, something felt wrong. The children were told not to speak their native languages. They were punished if they did. They were told their traditional names were too primitive. So each child was assigned a new name from a foreign book. Adwoa became called Anna. They were told the ways of their ancestors were foolish, backward, and uneducated. They were taught that true wisdom came only from foreign lands. At first, Adwoa resisted. She argued. She defended her people. She said her father was wise, though he never entered a classroom, and her mother strong, though she never read a book. But every time she spoke, she was humiliated before the others. The teachers mocked her. They laughed at her village ways. They said she would remain poor forever if she clung to primitive beliefs. Slowly, little by little, day after day, the confidence inside her began to crack. Months passed, then years. Adwoa learned to read, write, and speak beautifully in the foreign tongue. She learned mathematics, science, politics, and philosophy. But she also learned something more dangerous. She learned shame, shame of where she came from, shame of her parents, shame of the village that once loved her. By the time she turned 19, she no longer answered to Adwoa. She demanded everyone call her Anna. She no longer braided her hair in village styles. She wore city clothes and mocked traditional dresses. She no longer believed in ancestral wisdom. She laughed whenever someone mentioned village customs. When at last she returned home after many years, her parents rushed to welcome her. But the young woman who stepped down from the carriage was no longer the daughter they remembered. She stared at the mud huts with disgust. She looked at her father's rough hands and called him dirty. She looked at her mother's cooking pot and called it primitive. The villagers whispered among themselves in confusion. Was this truly Adwa? Her father embraced her, tears streaming down his face, but she barely touched him back. That night, when the family gathered for celebration, Adwoa shocked everyone. She announced she would not stay in Asokora. She said the village was beneath her. She said she now belonged among educated people in the city. Her mother wept silently. Her father begged her not to forget the sacrifices they made. But Adwoa laughed coldly and said ignorance was the disease of poor people. The room fell silent. The elders exchanged worried glances. That night, old Nana Yaboa, the oldest man in the village, called Kwaku aside and warned him that something had been stolen from his daughter, and it was not her body, but her spirit. Kwaku did not understand. He only prayed his daughter would change. But Adwoa did not change. She returned to the city and quickly rose in status. Her education opened doors. She entered government circles. Wealthy men sought her hand in marriage. Powerful people praised her intelligence. Soon she forgot the village completely, except when using her story to inspire others, though she always left out the part about being from Asokora, ashamed of her roots. Then one day, a powerful minister named Mensima invited her to his estate. He praised her brilliance and offered her a position in his council. But first he asked her one question. He asked if she would be willing to help modernize the rural villages by convincing them to surrender their lands for development. Adwoa did not hesitate. She agreed immediately. She believed she was helping progress. She believed she was civilizing the backward places she once called home. Her first assignment was to return to Asokor and persuade the villagers to sign away their lands for a grand factory and road project. When she arrived, the village welcomed her despite the pain she had caused before. Her father smiled with hope, thinking perhaps his daughter had returned changed. But during the meeting beneath the sacred tree, Adwoa stood before her own people and urged them to abandon their farms, surrender their lands, and trust the government promises of jobs and money. The elders were stunned. Nana Yaboa rose slowly and stared into her eyes. Then he asked one chilling question. He asked, "Child, when did the enemy begin wearing the face of our own children?" The villagers murmured in fear. Adwoa grew angry and called them fools. She accused them of fearing progress. She said education had opened her eyes while they remained blind. But Nana Yaboa stepped forward and pointed his trembling finger toward her, saying, "No, child. Education did not open your eyes. It closed them. They did not teach you to think. They taught you to obey. They did not sharpen your mind. They replaced it. You believe you are free because you wear their clothes and speak their words, but your chains are simply invisible." The words struck her like thunder, but pride would not let her show it. Furious, she stormed away and vowed never to return. Yet that night, as she lay in her childhood hut, unable to sleep, the old man's words echoed in her mind again and again. Then, just before midnight, she overheard voices outside. She crept to the window and froze. It was the minister's men speaking in hushed tones. One laughed and said once the villagers signed the papers, they would burn the homes and remove anyone who resisted. Another laughed and said the people were fools, but the educated girl was even easier to use because she thought she was one of them. Adwoa's blood ran cold. Her hands trembled. In that moment, the truth crashed into her heart like lightning. She had not been empowered. She had been used. She had not become free. She had become their weapon, and worse, she had nearly destroyed her own people with her own hands. Adwoa stood frozen in the darkness, her breath caught in her throat, her entire body shaking as the cruel laughter of the minister's men drifted through the night air like poison. And for the first time in many years, she felt the heavy weight of shame pressing down on her chest harder than ever before. Because in that terrible moment she understood the truth that old Nana Yaboa had tried to show her. The truth that the education she had worshipped had not truly lifted her people, but had turned her into a polished servant for men who looked down on her and mocked the very people she came from. And though they praised her face, they laughed behind her back, seeing her not as an equal, but as a useful fool. And tears filled her eyes as memories flooded her mind. Memories of her father sweating beneath the hot sun to pay for her schooling. Memories of her mother wrapping food for her journey with trembling hands. Memories of the villagers singing blessings as she left, believing she would one day return to save them. And instead she had come back to betray them. And as she stared into the darkness, her stomach twisted with sickness. And before she could think, she rushed outside barefoot into the night, running across the dusty ground until she reached Nana Yaboa's hut, pounding on the wooden door with desperate hands. And when the old man opened the door and saw her tear-stained face, he said nothing, only stepped aside and allowed her in. And Adwoa fell to her knees before him, sobbing like a broken child, confessing everything she had heard, confessing how blind she had been, how proud she had become, how she had mocked her own blood, and the old man listened in silence until she finished. Then slowly he bent down and lifted her to her feet and said softly that the greatest prison is the one a person enters believing it is a palace. And Adwoa cried harder than ever, begging for forgiveness, begging for a way to make things right. And Nana Yaboa told her that forgiveness begins when truth is faced, but redemption comes only through sacrifice. And so before dawn, Adwoa gathered the elders and revealed the full plan of the minister, telling them of the lies, the burning, the murder being prepared in secret. And though many villagers were furious, especially her father, who could not look at her without pain in his eyes, Nana Yaboa urged them to listen, because now the daughter who once betrayed them might yet become the one to save them. And the elders agreed to prepare quietly while pretending to accept the government's offer. And for the next 3 days the village acted as though nothing was wrong, while secretly hiding their children, gathering weapons and planning escape routes into the forest if attacked. And Adwoa returned to the minister with false smiles, telling him the villagers were ready to sign, and the minister praised her brilliance and promised her a promotion. But now every word from his mouth sounded like venom in her ears. And on the 4th day, the minister arrived with armed guards and workers carrying papers, wagons, and tools. And he stood proudly beneath the sacred tree, smiling as the villagers gathered, believing victory was in his hands. And Adwoa stood beside him, pretending loyalty, though her heart pounded so hard she feared it would burst. And the minister announced that this was the beginning of a new future, that the old ways would die and progress would rise. And then he handed the paper to Kwaku, Adwoa's father, ordering him to sign first as head farmer. But Kwaku looked at the paper, then at his daughter, and instead of signing, he tore it into pieces before the entire crowd. And the minister's face darkened instantly, and before he could react, Adwoa stepped forward and shouted that everyone run, and chaos exploded like thunder as villagers scattered, while hidden men leapt from huts and trees with farming tools, sticks, stones, and spears, attacking the guards in a storm of fury. And the minister screamed in rage, ordering his men to burn the village. But flames never rose because the villagers had soaked the roofs with water beforehand, and the guards were overwhelmed by the people they had thought weak. And in the middle of the madness, the minister grabbed Adwoa by the arm and dragged her toward his carriage, hissing that if she wanted to betray him, she would die with the animals she loved so much. And he struck her hard across the face before pulling the knife. But before he could stab her, Kwaku charged like a lion and tackled the man to the dirt, and father and minister fought brutally while Adwoa screamed in horror. And the Kwaku was older and weaker. Rage gave him strength, and he beat the minister until guards pulled him off, but then Nana Yaboa struck one guard from behind, and the villagers swarmed the rest until the minister and his surviving men fled into the forest, wounded and humiliated, and when the dust settled, the village stood bruised and shaken, but alive, and Adwoa rushed to her father, who lay bleeding from a wound in his side. And she held him in her arms, sobbing, begging him not to leave her, begging for forgiveness. And Kwaku looked into her eyes, and though pain filled his face, he smiled gently and touched her cheek, saying that every lost child can still find the road home if their heart remembers where it began. And Adwoa cried as she pressed her forehead to his chest. And in that moment she felt something inside her heal for the first time in years. But their victory was short-lived, because by sunset, scouts returned with terrible news. The minister had not run away in defeat. He had gone to gather soldiers from the city, and by morning they would return in greater numbers than before, enough to wipe Asakor from the earth forever, and panic spread through the village as women cried and men argued. But then all eyes turned to Adwoa, and for the first time, she stood before her people, not with pride, but with humility, and she said the enemy's greatest weapon was never their guns or their wealth. It was knowledge, and if knowledge had been used to deceive her, then now she would use it against them. And she laid out a plan unlike anything the villagers had heard before, using everything the schools had taught her about military formations, road structures, communication systems, and strategy. And through the night, the villagers worked under her command, digging traps along the narrow road to the village, placing sharpened stakes beneath leaves, cutting trees to fall across paths, setting hidden fire pits, and preparing false trails to confuse the enemy. And by dawn, the village looked peaceful again, silent as if abandoned. And when the soldiers marched in with the minister at their head, they laughed at the empty streets, believing the villagers had fled. But then the traps began. Horses fell screaming into pits. Wagons crashed into hidden ditches. Trees collapsed onto marching men. Fire burst from hidden trenches, and confusion spread like madness as warriors leapt from the forest on every side, and Adwoa stood atop the sacred hill, directing the defense with fierce precision, shouting orders, moving fighters, turning every lesson the school gave her into a weapon against those who taught it. And the minister saw her and screamed her name in fury, charging toward her through the smoke like a demon. And as he reached the hill, he raised his pistol at her chest, smiling with murderous triumph. But before he could fire, a stone flew from nowhere and struck his temple with brutal force, and he collapsed dead into the dust. And standing behind him, with a sling in hand, was Ifia, Adwoa's mother, her face burning with fierce love and fury. And the soldiers broke in terror at their leader's death and fled back toward the city, leaving the people of Asakore victorious. Mother, her face burning with fierce love and fury. And the soldiers broke in terror at their leader's death and fled back toward the city, leaving the people of Asakore victorious. But as the sun rose over the battlefield and smoke drifted into the morning sky, Adwoa looked around at her people and understood something deeply. Education itself had never been the enemy. Ignorance had never been the enemy. The true enemy was who controlled the knowledge and what purpose they used it for, and from that day onward, she swore no child from Asakore would ever again be taught to hate themselves in the name of learning. The morning after the battle, the people of Asakore gathered beneath the sacred tree with wounds on their skin, smoke still rising from the earth, and fear still resting in their hearts. But there was also something else in the air that had not been there before. Something stronger than fear, stronger than pain, stronger even than grief, and that was awakening, because the villagers had now seen with their own eyes what many elders had whispered for generations. The danger does not always come carrying swords. Sometimes it comes smiling with promises, carrying books and speaking sweet words. And as the sun rose higher, the people turned their eyes toward Adwoa, no longer seeing the proud girl who had once returned with shame in her heart, but seeing a woman transformed by painful truth, a woman who had walked into darkness and returned with her eyes opened, and though many were still wounded by what she had done before, none could deny that she had fought for them when it mattered most. And so Nana Yaboa rose slowly and declared before all the people that the daughter who had once lost her way had now found the path again, and the village answered with a great cry of agreement. And Adwoa fell to her knees weeping, for she knew she did not deserve such mercy, yet still they gave it. And in that moment she learned the power of a people who choose healing over hatred. And in the weeks that followed, Asakore changed forever, because Adwoa gathered the children of the village every evening beneath the same sacred tree where the elders once taught stories, and she began teaching them everything she had learned in the city, reading, writing, counting, science, and strategy. But unlike the teachers who had trained her, she taught them without stripping away their identity. She taught them their native tongue first before any foreign language. She taught them the wisdom of the ancestors beside the knowledge of books. She taught them that no education is true if it requires you to hate where you come from. And soon children from nearby villages began coming to learn. Then their parents came too, and before long, the little gatherings beneath the tree became the first true school the people had ever built for themselves, one not made to create servants, but to create thinkers, leaders, and protectors of their own future. And word of what had happened spread far across the land, reaching chiefs, merchants, and even rulers in distant towns. And many came to see the woman who had defied the government and turned its own teachings against it. And among them came a powerful elder from the city named Nana Bediako, a man respected by chiefs and feared by politicians. And after hearing her story, he warned her that though Minister Mensima was dead, the men above him would not forget what had happened, because powerful people do not forgive humiliation. And Adwoa listened carefully, for deep inside she knew the battle was not over, and she was right, because months later rumors reached Asakore that government officials in the capital were furious, not simply because their plan had failed, but because the story of a village defeating trained soldiers had begun inspiring others, and the rulers feared rebellion spreading across the land like fire. And soon secret agents were sent into nearby towns asking questions, gathering names, hunting for Adwoa. And one night, as the village slept, a messenger arrived breathless from another town with terrible warning. Soldiers were marching again, this time not dozens, but hundreds. And they were under orders to arrest Adwoa and destroy anyone who protected her. And panic spread through Asakore once more. But this time Adwoa stood before the people calm and strong, and she said if they stayed, the village would be slaughtered. But if they ran now, they would lose everything they had fought for. And after long silence, she made the hardest choice of her life. She told them she would leave alone and surrender herself, because if the enemy wanted her, then she would not allow the whole village to die for one person. But the villagers refused at once, shouting that they would never hand her over. Yet Kwaku stepped forward and said sometimes the hardest thing for a leader is not knowing how to fight, but knowing when to sacrifice. And tears filled Adwoa's eyes as she embraced her parents one final time before leaving at dawn in secret, carrying only a small bag in her courage. And by midday, soldiers stormed into Asokore but found no trace of her. And for many weeks she fled from town to town, hiding among traders, farmers, and travelers, while government men searched relentlessly. But wherever she went, she shared her story. And the more she spoke, the more people listened. And the more they listened, the angrier they became, because many had suffered the same lies she had. Many had seen schools used not to empower but to erase, not to build pride but to create obedient minds. And slowly her message spread beyond villages into towns, into markets, into courts, into houses of chiefs and leaders. And before long, what began as whispers became open conversation, and then open defiance. And people began demanding change in the way children were taught, demanding schools that respected culture, demanded teachers who uplifted rather than humiliated, demanded education that gave wisdom without stealing identity. And the government panicked, for they had hoped to silence one woman, but now her voice had multiplied into thousands. And one evening, while hiding in the city, Adwoa was betrayed by a man seeking reward money, and soldiers captured her after a brutal chase through narrow streets, dragging her before the governor himself, a cold man named Lord Whitmore, who sat behind a great desk and stared at her with cruel amusement. And he asked if she understood the trouble she had caused, and Adwoa stood bruised and chained but proud, and said yes, she understood perfectly. And when he asked if she regretted it, she smiled and answered no. And the governor's face hardened as he told her she would be made an example of, publicly tried and executed for treason, hoping her death would silence the rebellion forever. But on the day of her trial, something unexpected happened. The streets outside the courthouse filled with people, not dozens but thousands, men and women from villages and cities, chiefs and traders, mothers and fathers, students and elders, all shouting her name, all demanding her freedom. And the crowd grew so large the soldiers could barely control it. And inside the court, the governor watched in horror, as witness after witness stood not against her but for her, telling stories of children beaten for speaking their language, of traditions mocked and erased, of minds twisted to hate themselves. And as the truth poured out before everyone, the governor realized too late that killing Adwoa would only turn her into a martyr. And under enormous pressure, he was forced to release her to calm the people. And when she stepped outside the courthouse, the crowd roared so loudly, the very ground seemed to shake, and people lifted her onto their shoulders like a hero, and tears streamed down her face because she had once believed education made her better than her people. But now she saw true greatness was standing with them, not above them. And that night, as drums echoed across the city and celebration filled the air, Adwoa looked to the sky and whispered a promise that she would spend the rest of her life making sure no child would ever again mistake education for worth or foreign approval for wisdom. And though many battles still lay ahead, one truth had become clear across the land. The girl they deceived using education had become the woman who exposed the deception to the world. The weeks after Adwoa's release changed the land in ways no one could have imagined, because what had once been quiet frustration, hidden in whispers, now became a fire that spread from village to village, town to town, and city to city. And everywhere people began asking the same dangerous question. If the education we were given was truly meant to help us, then why did it teach us to hate ourselves? And that question shook the powerful like thunder in the sky. Because rulers can control people who are poor. Rulers can control people who are afraid. But rulers fear nothing more than people who begin to question the very ideas they were taught to obey. And Adwoa became more than a woman. She became a symbol, and though some praised her while others hated her, no one could ignore her any longer, and invitations poured in from chiefs, scholars, merchants, and leaders across the region asking her to come and speak. And so she traveled from place to place, sharing her story, standing before crowds in market squares, in palace courts, in dusty fields beneath the open sky, telling them how she had once believed intelligence meant becoming like those who ruled over her, how she had mocked her own parents, how she had rejected her people, how she had nearly destroyed her home because she mistook borrowed knowledge for true wisdom. And each time she spoke, the crowds listened in silence, because many saw themselves in her story, and many wept because they too had felt ashamed of their roots after being taught that everything native was backward. And over time, Adwoa began working with elders and thinkers from many communities to build a new learning system, one that joined modern education with ancestral understanding, one that taught children science without stripping away spirituality, reading without erasing identity, discipline without destroying self-worth. And slowly schools began rising in places where only foreign-controlled classrooms once stood, and the people themselves built them with their own hands, mothers carrying wood, fathers shaping clay, elders donating land, and young people volunteering to teach. And though the government hated what was happening, they could no longer stop it openly because public support for Adwoa had grown too great, and even some former teachers quietly joined her cause, confessing that they too had long known the truth but feared speaking out. And for the first time in generations, many children began learning while still loving who they were. And years passed, and Adwoa's name spread far beyond the region, until travelers from distant lands came to hear of the woman who challenged the minds of empires. And yet with all her fame, she never forgot Asukora, never forgot the sacred tree, never forgot the dust of the road she once walked as a child. And every season, she returned home to sit beside her aging parents, who now smiled with pride whenever her name was spoken. And one evening, as the orange sun dipped low and painted the sky with gold, Kwaku sat beside her outside the family hut and asked quietly if she still regretted leaving all those years ago, and Adwoa looked at him with tears in her eyes and said yes. But she also knew now that sometimes a person must walk into darkness before they understand the value of light. And her father smiled gently and said, perhaps that was why the ancestors allowed her journey, because some people are born not only to learn truth, but to survive lies so they can warn others. And those words stayed with her forever. But peace never lasts forever in the world. And many years later, another foreign governor rose to power, one harsher and more ruthless than those before him. And he feared Adwoa's influence deeply, knowing her teachings threatened the obedience of future generations, and so secretly he arranged for assassins to end her life quietly, hoping to remove her without public uproar. And one stormy night, as rain hammered the rooftops and thunder rolled across the heavens, killers crept toward her home while she slept in the village. But fate had other plans, because young students keeping watch spotted the shadows moving through the dark and raised the alarm, and within moments the whole village awoke in chaos. Drums beating warnings through the rain, men rushing with spears, women grabbing torches, children fleeing to safety, and the assassins were surrounded before they reached her door, captured and beaten until they confessed who sent them. And when the truth spread, the people erupted in fury greater than ever before, and massive protests broke out across the land, demanding the governor step down, and unable to control the unrest, he was removed from power in disgrace. And after that, no ruler ever dared openly move against Adwoa again, and in her old age she became known simply as Na Adwoa, Mother Adwoa, the teacher of teachers, the woman who opened eyes, and students came from far and wide just to hear her wisdom. And when asked what the greatest lesson of her life had been, she always gave the same answer, saying, "Education without truth is more dangerous than ignorance, because ignorance can be corrected, but deception disguised as wisdom can enslave generations." And when at last her time came, many years later, and she passed peacefully in her sleep beneath the roof of the same village where she was born, the mourning stretched across the land for weeks, and thousands gathered to honor her. Kings sent gifts, elders sang songs, mothers lifted their children and whispered her story into their ears so they would never forget. And beneath the sacred tree where it all began, they carved her final words into stone for every generation after to read. And those words said, "Learn all you can, but never let anyone teach you to despise your own reflection." And even now, long after her passing, the people still tell her story by firelight, not only as a warning, but as a lesson. Because the greatest trick ever played upon her was not making her uneducated, but making her believe that education meant becoming ashamed of herself. And that is how they deceived her, using education. Our channel, Forgotten Black History, is dedicated to uncovering powerful truths and untold stories from our past. Family, before you go, tell us once again where you are watching from, your city and country. We love seeing how far this community reaches across the world. If you have not already done so, please subscribe and like this video to help our channel grow.